Hi. So, this is supposed to be a booktube channel, and I promise it will actually be that at some point. So today, I'm going to talk about books, and the book I'd like to talk about today is Dreamsongs Volume 2 by George R.R. Martin. This is, of course, mostly non A Song of Ice and Fire stuff. It's short stories and novellas that Martin wrote before, like, 1990. There's a lot of great stuff here. I have, of course, already read Dreamsongs Volume 1 a while ago. I'm not really going to be talking about it because I read it, I think, like 3 years ago. And there's a lot of amazing stories in Dreamsongs Volume 1 and a lot of really thought-provoking stuff and stuff that I would love to discuss that I hope to discuss with people in the future. Because I will just say right off the bat, yeah, like, Dreamsongs Volume 1 is incredible. It is probably the better of the two halves of this collection. And I honestly probably had much more to say about the stories in Dreamsongs Volume 1 than I do uh, right now about the stories in Dreamsongs Volume 2. But that is for another time. So, I unfortunately do not have a physical copy of this book with me right now because I checked it out from my school library like right before I graduated high school, and then I needed to return it to the library, which was a bit of an issue. Makes sense. I would like to be able to reference it right now as I'm talking about these stories, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do that. So, too bad for me. Without further ado, I'm going to start with the first story, A Beast for Norn. Of course, there are also essays preceding every section of Dreamsongs, both volumes 1 and 2. Those are, of course, some of the best parts of these collections. I think anybody who's read that can tell you that. They're very interesting and provide a lot of insight into George R. R. Martin's life and his writing career and stuff like that. A lot of them are great essays. You should go read those essays. You should go read this collection, and if you can find some of those essays on their own, they're honestly probably worth reading on their own. However, I'm not going to really talk about the first couple essays here because I don't remember them very well. I read them like a month ago or something, or more than that, I don't know. The first section of Dreamsongs Volume 2 is the tough voyaging section. It's called The Taste of Tough. It's 2 tough voyaging stories. And people who aren't George R. R. Martin fans probably have no idea what tough voyaging is. It is this collection of stories about a guy named Haviland Tough, I think is his name. And he goes around the galaxy, meaning George R. R. Martin's Thousand Worlds universe, at least this small part of the Milky Way galaxy that inhabits. And he has this big old ship with which he performs these incredible feats of ecological engineering on the planets that he visited. Now, these 2 stories are the only tough voyaging stories I have read so far, and these 2 stories were my introduction to tough voyaging. The first one, as I said, A Beast for Norn. This is clever. I thought it was engaging. The writing is perhaps not quite as strong, in my opinion, at least from what I vaguely recall and from the notes I wrote here. Perhaps not quite as strong as Martin's writing in many of his other works. However, it's still pretty good, and the style of the story and the plot of the story give it this sort of almost fable-like or parable-like quality. You'll see what I mean if you read it. It's kind of almost like a fable. However, I do think to some people it might come across as slightly cheesy or slightly tropey, which is something that Martin is usually very good at getting away with because he's really, really good at writing atmosphere. However, this story he might not quite get away with it with some readers. Okay, next story is Guardians, also Tough Voyaging. I feel like I read these so long ago, but as I think I said, I wrote some notes about what my thoughts on these were when I first read them, which wasn't really that long ago. Guardians is, I believe, one of the more famous and more well-liked Tough Voyaging stories, and that is for good reason. I really enjoyed it. It's very creative. It's very clever in terms of its plot. I enjoyed reading it, and I also think it's thematically strong, even if it's not quite as thematically complex, arguably, as some of Martin's other work. It is interesting and thought-provoking and probably relevant to the real world in some ways. I also will say that across both of the Tough Voyaging stories, I think that the characterization of Tough was very strong and it was consistent, and just in general, this is a good story. There are also illustrations, by the way, in Dreamsongs, and it just bothered me that the illustration at the start of this story doesn't, match the description of the things in the story for no reason whatsoever. It's totally unjustifiable. Anyway, that is the entire Tough Voyaging section in this. So, it's tomorrow. The next section in this collection is screenplays. There are 2 screenplays here. They're pretty good. I would suggest you read them if you're a big George Martin fan, if you just enjoy reading screenplays, which actually worked pretty well. First one is called The Road Less Taken. It was pretty good. It was a very fast read, as you would expect, because it's formatted in that sort of style where of a screenplay, and that makes it move very quickly, and it's mostly dialogue. I thought the main character, Jeff, was written pretty well. I thought the establishment of his character was well executed, and I thought it had an interesting concept as a story. The other thing about that first screenplay is I believe that that's the one that actually made it on screen. It was made into an episode of The Twilight Zone. The next one, Doorways, I believe was not, at least in the form in which it is presented in Dreamsongs. The thing that I read is, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's the original version of this story that George wrote, and then people, his higher-ups or whoever, wanted him to change it, so then he rewrote it, but the version I read is the original version. I did think this story was pretty good. Both of these are pretty good. They're not great, but they're decent. Doorways was pretty satisfying for me. When I wrote my notes, I wrote that it had a characteristically very George Martin-ish ending. If you've read a lot of his short stories, you know what I'm talking about. He has a certain style of ending that he likes to do. I think for some people, his endings might feel a bit abrupt, and sometimes they are not the most conclusive, but he has a certain style of ending that he really likes. And I think a lot of people don't know this because A Song of Ice and Fire is unfinished. But he has a definite style of ending, and I have a pretty good idea, I think, of what the ending of A Song of Ice and Fire will be like atmospherically and tonally, or tonally at least, even if I don't know what's actually going to happen in terms of the plot. So, Doorways has this sort of alternate reality thing that I think is done a bit suspiciously. I'm generally not a big fan of time travel and alternate realities and stuff like that. It doesn't really work for me. It sort of breaks suspension of disbelief because it's not really believable in the way that it's usually done. Which I think is also kind of ironic because George has that blog post from a while ago titled Beware the Butterflies or something like that, right? And being wary of the butterflies is exactly the sort of thing that you need to do when you're writing something like these alternate realities. And I don't think George really did that when writing this story, whenever he wrote this story. In addition, I think there's a sort of thing that I would somewhat like to discuss with other people in this story, which is the possibility of whether or not George is trying to imply like a romance between two of the characters, which would be a very George thing to do, but it would also be a thing that I think a lot of people would not necessarily like. And I would be interested in discussing that with people and seeing whether or not they think that's what was going on, and if that was what was going on, what they think about it. Anyway, on to the next section, which is wildcards. If you know stuff about George, you know about the existence of wildcards. There are like some absurd number of wildcards books. It's like 15 or 20 or something. The first few had significant portions of them, I think, written by Martin, and all of them were edited by Martin. And Martin created a good number of the main characters that are present. The wildcard stories that appear in this collection are both written by Martin. I'm not going to say a lot about them. You can go read them if you want. I think if you're a big fan of George Martin, you should read them. If you like sort of superhero stories, you should read them, because that's what they are. They're superhero stories. And I think, like many of George's stories, and in reality, like pretty much every story by everybody ever, these are very much inspired by George's own life. And I think particularly the first story can give you a certain amount of insight into George's psyche and what he's like. The main character in that story is very much a sort of author insert. I think in the essay preceding these, George admitted that that character was a self-insert, essentially. And I think if you're interested in that sort of thing, George's life and the way he thinks about things, particularly the first story here, but also the second one, can be possibly very interesting in that regard. Now, the second story is written in a journal-type format. I think that is executed very well. However, because of its nature as what George calls an interstitial narrative, meaning that it was written to stitch together multiple other stories in a wildcards book, you get this sort of odd thing where the journal is simply like missing large parts of the story at hand, because those occur presumably in the other narratives that are present. However, I read it that way. I still thought it was pretty good. I do think you can enjoy it that way. I did, but it's a bit odd. That's pretty much what I'm going to say. I will also perhaps put one of my favorite quotes from that second story, The Journal of Xavier Desmond, up on screen right now. Blah. We go somewhere, because it's a good quote. Anyway, the next section is the long section, is the final section of Dreamsongs, and it's called The Heart in Conflict, in reference to the quote, the heart in conflict with itself, right, is what makes, like, it's the human heart in conflict with itself. And George really likes to talk about that quote as that being the only thing that good stories are about. And since that's so broad, I would tend to agree with him. I believe that it's like a William Faulkner quote originally. The essay preceding this section is a brilliant essay. I love it. I think that it's incredibly accurate, both in terms of what it's saying about genre in literature, but also the general themes and ideas presented in this essay are relevant far beyond just genre and literature. They are relevant to so many things in life. And it's just an amazing essay. If you can find it, I believe the actual title of the essay might be like something about furniture. It's like Furniture Rules or something like that. I think that's the same essay, but it's not titled as it is presented in Dreamsongs. You can probably find it on its own online, and you should go read it, no matter who you are, if you like books, or even if you don't read books, to be honest, but I don't think you're watching this. Probably nobody's watching this. I think that it should be taught in English classes, probably. If I was teaching an English class, I think I would make my students read this essay. It's an incredible essay. Anyway, So this next story and the first story in this last section is actually a rewrite of a story that appeared in Dreamsongs Volume 1. That story is The Fortress, and this story in Dreamsongs Volume 2 is Under Siege. Under Siege adds a lot of sci-fi elements and is longer than the original. The ending's very different, even though large parts of the text are identical. Unfortunately, I don't actually remember The Fortress all that well. It would be better if I did. It was originally written as an assignment for a college history class, and George asked the professor if he could write a story instead of an essay, and he let him do this, and the story he wrote was The Fortress, and this is, as I said, an adaptation, or it's a rewrite. He made changes to that story. So they're really two different stories. The ending of this is very ambiguous in a characteristically George Martin-ish way. I will also say that this story has a lot of possible implications for the Bloodraven plotline in A Song of Ice and Fire that are not really present in The Fortress. Okay, next story. The Skin Trade. I believe this is the longest story, or the longest story excepting the Hedge Knight in this collection. Unfortunately, I don't really have much to say about it. Up to this point in the collection, it was by far the most intricately plotted story, and there is probably a lot to discuss there. I do also think here there are some similarities to A Song of Ice and Fire, or things that are crossing over in terms of George using them between this and A Song of Ice and Fire, because George really likes to reuse things. You know this if you've read more than one thing by George R.R. Martin. Skin Trade is pretty good. I'm just going to move on. So before I get to the three stories that I really want to talk the most about, I do want to say that this collection, of course, includes The Hedge Knight, which is the first Dunk and Egg novella. I have already read The Hedge Knight in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and I did not reread it. I probably should have reread it because it's great, but as I said, I needed to return this book to the library. I didn't really have time, so I just skipped it. Dunk and Egg is amazing. The Hedge Knight is probably the best story in this collection. However, I don't know, I read it like 2 years ago or something, so it's not something I'm going to talk about right now. It's not really something that there's much point in it being in here, to be honest. It's already very available in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is the collection that I read it in. Anyway, the next story that I'm going to talk about is Unsound Variations, which is, as George puts it, his chess story. I will say I was honestly not a big fan of the extended descriptions of chess moves. That wasn't particularly interesting to me. However, I did think the story as a whole was pretty good, and the chess part is not bad, but yeah, I wasn't a big fan of how that was done here. There were some very well-written sort of melancholic sections in this story that I'm a big fan of. I think that the main character's wife, Kathy, is written very well. She's sort of very unlikable at the start of the story, and the way that George writes her sort of plays with your emotions a bit in a way that I think is very effective. I will also say that I think I can see why someone might find this story somewhat cheesy. However, that cheesiness is largely solved by Kathy's presence, pointing out how cheesy all the things in the story are. The other thing about this story is that it is a story about an author, which is unsurprising. This thing that authors like to do, and George does it. He also writes stories about journalists. That's what the Armageddon Rag is. But in Unsound Variations, there's this description of a book called Beasts in a Cage. It's the main character's book. And just based off of the short description that is present in this story, I already like the idea for that book, but sadly, I'm never going to get it. Also, unsurprisingly, there are some sci-fi, or you might really say fantasy elements introduced partway through this story. I was not really a big fan of the introduction of those elements. However, I did appreciate that when they were introduced, a lot of the other characters in the story did not really believe the person who was saying this stuff in introducing them. And I also think, despite their importance to the plot and the ending, that the ending of this story actually worked very well for me. It was a really good ending. So, next story is The Glass Flower. Some technical difficulties prevented me from continuing to record, so I guess I'm making this video over the course of like a week. The Glass Flower is great. This is a beautifully written story about identity that explores its themes through the metaphor of, guess what, a glass flower. And I will probably put up on screen a long list of a bunch of attributes of the glass flower that I wrote, and maybe that'll make some of you go, hey, what's this about? And then you'll go read the story. So this is, I believe, the final story that George ever wrote in the Thousand Worlds universe. It introduces some new stuff. It also explains and ties back to a lot of the sort of lore that was mentioned in various Thousand Worlds stories previously, which is pretty cool. It's also pretty heavy on dialogue, which is true of many of the stories in this collection. I don't think I've really mentioned that explicitly aside from with the TV scripts, but that is definitely true across this book. Not universally, but it's generally true of many of the stories in this book. There's also, of course, again, similarly to many other stories here, some connection to A Song of Ice and Fire, or at least there are things that you might be able to infer about A Song of Ice and Fire from reading this, perhaps. One thing is that there's a character in here named Dorian, who is pretty much just Dario Naharis, in my opinion, or however you pronounce his name. In addition to that, there are some things that didn't really make sense to me, and there's some questions that I have of various sorts. I'd really love to discuss those with other people, and just in general, there's so much to talk about. Another thing I appreciate is the slight ambiguity of this story in terms of the message that is being conveyed about things such as immortality and artificiality. This is a story that engages with ideas such as death being eternal and always present, and the idea that any living thing is in the process of dying, and if that's true, then is something that is not in the process of dying, therefore not alive. And I think in relation to these sorts of things, there's sort of a certain amount of conflict between two characters in terms of their perspectives, and I think that both of those perspectives are portrayed in a reasonable way, including the one that George seems to agree less with. I'm not really sure that I would agree with what I think that George's perspective here is, but in reality, I'm just not sure. This story touches upon some of the hardest to answer and some of the most unresolved and interesting questions in philosophy, such as whether or not it really is possible to artificially recreate consciousness, and what consciousness is, which is without a doubt an unsolved question. We do not understand consciousness, and therefore a lot of the things that are brought up in this story are sort of just open to interpretation, and they're things that I really just am not sure about. On to the final story, and my favorite story in Volume 2 of Dreamsongs, Portraits of His Children. This is another story about an author which fundamentally deals with the question of who is allowed to tell whose story. This hit very, very close to home for me, and I would strongly suggest if you are an author that you should go read this. And in my experience, many people who read fantasy are also interested in writing fantasy, so that probably applies to a very large portion of this video's hypothetical audience. You should definitely read this. No question about it.